Up until now, all of the data that we've been using has been created within Grasshopper itself. But what if you have something drawn in Rhino and you want that to take part into the definition? Well, we have to create a reference, a link between these two things. The way that we normally do that would be, for example, right click on an input of a component and say set one or set multiple. For example, here in the surface, if I wanted to create a loft, I could right click here and say set multiple curves to create the loft. What I actually prefer to do is to use the params geometry. This way we have a specific place where our geometry is referenced and then we can use it in multiple components. Let's start with a point. I don't actually have any points drawn in Rhino, but if I did, it's not going to assume which points I want to use. We'll have to tell it explicitly the points. Let's see what happens if I right click and say set one point. Grasshopper went away. Don't worry though, it's going to come back when we're finished. It's going to get out of the way, let you do your thing in Rhino, and when we're finished and press enter, Grasshopper will come back with that reference. In this case, because I don't have anything drawn in Rhino, notice that the point location type is coordinate, meaning I could type in some values for x, y, and z, or I can just click somewhere in the Rhino model, which is what I'm going to do. There we go. This point isn't actually selectable in Rhino, but I just want to highlight this because it does provide an interesting way to interact with the point. If I select it, notice that I get this gumball widget. That is, if you have display gumball selected, which by default you should. It's still not selectable here, but if I select it in Grasshopper, I can move that around as if it was drawn in Rhino. What if I actually did have a point drawn in Rhino? Let's draw one. I'll bring down another params geometry and point. I'm going to right click here and set one point. Grasshopper goes away, and the type now is type equals point. We can click on this to switch between the different types, and curve just means select some point along a curve. In this case, because I have a point object, I'll choose point. And there we go. Rhino and Grasshopper are now linked. If I select it here, in Grasshopper it highlights, and it's different than highlighting this one, because this one was just drawn with Grasshopper. So it only exists in Grasshopper, even though I see it and I can interact with it in Rhino. In the case of the second point, it's drawn in Rhino, and I should interact with it within Rhino itself. So I also can get the gumball and move it around in Rhino. Now this is one. What about multiples? Well, let's draw multiple points. I'm going to right click here so I can draw multiple points. I'm going to bring down another params geometry point. I'm going to right click, set multiple points, and select all of these. All right. But which order are these points in? I just did a window selection. I didn't specify one by one the order. I'm going to use a couple of components to make this a little bit more visible. I'm going to go to display, vector, and I'm going to use point list and point order. And I'll plug the points into the p inputs. One thing to highlight. First of all, notice a new cable type. It's a double parallel cable. This is just telling us that we're actually transmitting more than one thing, a list. We're going to get deeper into lists in a later video. For now, let's see how these two components help us to see the order of the points. First of all, I'm going to right click here on S and make the text a little bit bigger. This actually shows us the index of the point in the list. Here it starts at 0, then 1, etc. And this one shows the sort of direction in which the points go. So when you window select, Grasshopper is going to give you those points more or less in the order in which they were created, not necessarily a geometric or Cartesian order. If you want a different ordering, you have to actually specify that. So you can right click, set multiple points, and let's try to go sort of in a zigzag manner through the points. And then when we're done, let's press enter. All right, see that if you actually select the points one by one, Grasshopper is going to respect that order. There are, of course, other ways to organize points, and we'll look at that because if you have a million points, well, you're not going to pick one by one. Let's try some other things. What about curves? I'm going to draw here a circle, and let's see what we have. I'm going to go to params, geometry. Let's try circle. Set one circle. Ah, wait. I can't actually select the circle, and I don't have an option to just use a circle object. This circle param actually is just asking me to draw a circle, which isn't really what I want. I want to reference this very special circle that I've drawn in Rhino. So actually, circle, circular arc, line, plane, and rectangle are all parameters that will actually ask us to draw something in Rhino. They're not going to allow us to reference something drawn from Rhino. Any curve, whether that be a circle, an arc, a line, a polyline, a spline, a square, rectangle, whatever, any curve that we have drawn in Rhino should be referenced with the curve parameter. Let's right click, set one curve. There we go. What about surfaces? I'm going to go to surface, plane, corner to corner, and we have a small surface there. In params geometry, I have a parameter for surface. Right click, set one surface. There we go. We also have something called a BREP, Boundary Representation Object. And actually, a surface is a one-faced BREP. In Rhino, polysurfaces and surfaces are all under this term BREP, so we can actually use BREP as well to reference this surface. Finally, let's talk about meshes. I'll draw a mesh here with mesh, polygon mesh primitives, and sphere. Set one mesh. And there we go. Here we have kind of an interesting way to bring that geometry in, which could expose a couple of different workflows. Here the geometry pipeline is looking at a layer name, the name of an object, and the type of an object to bring those in. When you put it down on the canvas by default, the layer and name have a little asterisk, which means that it's going to look at any layer and any name. Now, for example, if I double click on the point, now I'm referencing all of the points that are in that layer. If I say curve, I get the curve, brep, I get the surface, and mesh, I get my mesh. Now, anytime I actually draw anything to any layer, that's going to be referenced here. So if I bring down another mesh, for example, mesh, mesh primitives, and box, notice that it automatically gets referenced in the pipeline. Let's talk about another way to reference things. Here in params primitive, we have this GUID. All Rhino objects get this globally unique identifier. It's a way that it's stored in the file. We can actually use the ID to reference the ID of the object. I'll right-click here, set one GUID, and I'll select the mesh. I'm not actually referencing the mesh. I'm just getting the globally unique identifier for the mesh. Because I know it's a mesh, I can actually pass this to params geometry and mesh, and it'll reference it there. I only mention this because there's some objects that you can draw in Rhino that are not necessarily supported by default in Grasshopper. Things like lights and blocks. This could potentially open up a way to reference those, and we might see that a little bit later on. But I also mention this because now we have two files to deal with, the Rhino file and the Grasshopper file. If we don't have those objects with those GUIDs open in a Rhino model, then we're going to get some strange behavior. Let's see what happens. Let's save both of these. I'm going to save this file here as ref. This is the Rhino model, so I went to the File, Save in the Rhino model, and I'm also going to save the Grasshopper file, Save Document, call that ref. What happens if I close the Rhino model? Let me just make a new one here. Notice that all of the components that had geometry reference from Rhino now turn orange. For example, this point up here says point with ID, blah, 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 failed to load. Grasshopper's actually looking at the open Rhino model, trying to find the objects with that ID, and if it finds it, it references it. If it doesn't find it, it's going to give you a warning. Let's see what happens when we open the file. Ref. Notice that Grasshopper automatically references those objects. I mention this because you don't necessarily need to have the Rhino file and the Grasshopper file in the same place. It's just looking for those globally unique identifiers. Having both files in the same area is helpful because, well, maybe we'll forget which file goes with what. I also mentioned that because if we did have a new file, and for example, we have a warning here that none of these points can be found, it doesn't mean that we can't use this part of the definition. It just means we need some geometry. So we can draw some more points and select them, right-click, set multiple points. We can still use the definition, we just need to give it some geometry. Another thing that I did there, notice that I selected the geometry first, I right-clicked, and then I set multiple points. Grasshopper still goes away, but it comes back very quickly. As you can see, we can really take advantage of drawing all sorts of things in Rhino and having those be working with Grasshopper definitions.